Hello, welcome back to the Bio 122 video lectures. This is video 12 talking about carnivores and herbivores because we're starting a new chapter today, chapter 34 on animal nutrition and digestive systems. Before we talk about carnivores and herbivores, let's talk about the general topics that this chapter will be covering, including the processes of digestion, of mechanical digestion, such as chewing, and also chemical digestion using enzymes to break uh, food particles down, and then the nutrients as they get absorbed, and then undigested material following along the four basic steps in the process. First, ingestion, and then digestion, and then absorption of the actual molecules that we call nutrients, and then elimination of that undigested material. Well, remember, animals are heterotrophic, meaning that we have to consume some of our organic molecules from other living beings because we cannot manufacture all of the organic molecules that we need. So, the first part of these lectures will concentrate on ingestion and specifically the type of foods that are being ingested, which allows us to break um, animals down into three general categories. The first of those being the herbivores, which are animals whose primary food source is going to be plant based. The second one is a carnivore, which would be seemingly the opposites. They are animals that eat other animals. Now, in all cases, there's no absolutes to these. Herbivores will sometimes eat animals, and carnivores will sometimes also eat plants. But this is talking about the primary reliance of a particular type of food source to provide the essential nutrients for that animal. Now, when we talk about carnivores, we have another term, actually two other terms, one of them being called obligate. So that means that these carnivores are obligated to eat other animals in that they rely entirely on animal flesh to obtain their nutrients. A good common example of this is cats. Um, Now, you may be aware, if you're a cat owner, that sometimes cats will nibble on grass. In fact, they even sell cat grass in pet stores. But the important thing to note there is the cat grass is not a nutrient. What that means is the cats are not breaking the carbohydrates down and the proteins down inside the grass to use as a nutrient. The reason cats nibble on plants and grass and things like this, it's actually thought to primarily just be an aid to remove fur balls from the stomach because as they're grooming, they consume the fur and it causes a knot in the stomach and it allows them to vomit it up easier. So it has purposes that are not related to nutrition. All right. So we're specifically talking about nutrients here, which is what's going to be digested. Cats do not possess the genes to manufacture the enzymes that are necessary to break down the nutrients in plants. But they do have the enzymes necessary to break nutrients down from animal flesh. It's obviously a different chemical reaction that's involved. So cats therefore must eat meat in order to be nutritionally sound. Another term that goes along with carnivores is facultative carnivore, or those that will, in addition to animal food, will also eat non-animal food. But generally, they will do the best if they're eating animal flesh. So that means that they do possess some enzymes that will allow them to break down plant-based material, but they're not as efficient as an herbivore would be. And so they're still going to be doing better if they are eating animal flesh. So then that leads us to our third category, which is the omnivore, which are animals that actually eat both plant and animals, and they do very well on either. Um, Very often, they generally need a combination of things. So they should have a combination of animal food and plant-based food. But in many cases, they can actually do, generally well by being generally one or the other. Having said that, and so good examples of that would be like the bear. Uh, this is a crawfish, which is actually the type of animals I use in my research lab that will eat anything. Crayfish will eat all sorts of plants and also, like I said, all sorts of meat, including each other. It's one of the problems in keeping crayfish. They will become cannibalistic if no other food is available. However, now that we've said this about herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore, just keep in mind that these are very, very general categories. And most animals, including the herbivores and the carnivores, will eat any type of food if it keeps them alive. So it's called being an opportunistic feeder. However, if you're an herbivore, you have the genetic makeup, meaning that you have the enzymes that will be most efficient if you're eating plant-based material. And likewise for a carnivore, you will do best eating animal flesh. But an omnivore, therefore, produces the enzymes that are necessary for a much wider range of food source. Well, let's also talk about a little bit of evolutionary adaptations that are seen with the choice of food. And we had talked previously about food is really one of the most important driving forces for evolution, because the ability to find food and to consume food when you're a heterotroph is absolutely critical for being able to produce offspring and allow them to survive. So we see that in evolutionary adaptations of vertebrates. Here's an example of the skull of a carnivore, of an herbivore, and of an omnivore. This is a dog skull, carnivore, and what we see in the dentation. So let's just kind of look at these teeth here and note that the the four major types of teeth, with the key down here, the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and the molars. So in a carnivore, we see that the skulls of all carnivores have evolved so that the incisors and canines are very, very sharp because they serve the purpose. So this gets back to form and function argument about evolution, because they serve the purpose of ripping and tearing flesh. And that's true also of the premolars and the molars. Note here that these are very sharp knife-like premolars. And the molars are really suppressed. There's only two of them typically on this particular skull. And so the molars are almost not necessary for the teeth in a carnivore. So let's switch to the opposite. And this is a horse skull. And if we look here, we see that the teeth are really still, we got incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. But notice it's really the complete opposite. In the fact the incisors don't even have upper rows of incisors. So those have been completely lost. The canines still exist, but note that they actually don't come together anymore. Whereas in the carnivores, these work like scissors. These are really pretty much useless in an herbivore. Instead, we look at the premolars and then notice that it's a much more prominent set of molars. And these are typically flat on the surface that are specifically designed for breaking apart grains. They almost work like a grain mill where they grind some of these very, very tough carbohydrates that make up fibers and seeds and nuts and things like that that would be in an herbivorous diet. Meanwhile, the incisors have become modified over time, and the function of them being only on the bottom, this essentially creates a shovel, because where is an herbivore going to find a lot of its food is grasses in the ground. And this actually works as a shovel to get underneath the roots and pull up the the grass. So this is typically the type of structure you see in a grazing animal. So now let's look at an omnivore. And a good example of an omnivore is humans. So here's a human skull. And notice that we have the molars and the premolars that are similar to the herbivore, which means we have the ability to grind grains and break apart fibers and grasses of plant-based material, but we're probably not as good at it as a pure herbivore. Meanwhile, we have canines, but our canines look pretty much the same as our incisors. But compared to the herbivore, we actually have both top and bottom incisors and canines aligned so that they can generate the scissoring type of action that would be seen in a carnivore. So we still have some ability to rip and tear flesh from animals. So the carnivore type of process, but not as efficient as a pure carnivore. And we also share some of the grain grinding ability of an herbivore, but not as efficient. So an omnivore fits kind of in a happy medium. More variety of food, which also means that we have some advantages in being able to find food in a wide range of environments. Okay, so here's just another picture of that, kind of blowing these up a little bit more, talking about omnivores, herbivores, and carnivores, so that the dentation accommodates both vegetation and meat for omnivores, mostly for herbivores, though, for grinding grasses and for shoveling things with the incisors. And then carnivores are really well designed for pulling apart flesh into small enough pieces to swallow. Okay, so that completes this first part of the chapter, and I'll see you next, and we'll start talking about some of the varieties of digestive systems. Cheers.